Good morning, everybody, and welcome to RUSI's Annual Information and Warfare Conference. I'm Karen Von Hippel, the new Director General here at RUSI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before I start, I would like to thank the sponsors for this conference, and in particular, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Airbus, L3, Atkins, CGI, Inmarsat, and Systematic. A special thanks as well to the sponsors of the C4ISR research program. That's Boeing Defence UK and Lockheed Martin. And then, of course, special thanks to the Ministry of Defence and Joint Forces Command. Why is this conference so important? I think, as Pete mentioned, it was clear from those of you who attended last year that many countries are perhaps too reliant on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance than others. It's also clear that information and the subsequent analysis can be subjected to false inputs, to manipulation, and external influence. If a country relies too heavily on collected intelligence, it could lead to poor decision-making, and certainly from my experience in the last 6 years inside the US government, when we were really bombarded by information, the challenge was all too apparent. Overdependency on ISR can also be a challenge, of course, for military operations, a point recognized in the Joint Forces Command paper, Warfare in the Information Age, from last year. The research that RUSI has done over this past year has exposed some of the flaws in our assumptions about how this field will develop in the future, and we are looking forward to being challenged by our research, as Pete mentioned. Our occasional paper, ISR in 2035 and beyond, suggests that the internet will fracture and be less useful for information sharing. The electromagnetic spectrum will become more congested. Spectrum deconfliction and governance may fail, and data deception will become more commonplace. So the upcoming challenges are enormous, and no one entity or government can solve them by themselves, and that's why we believe very firmly in public-private partnerships at RUSI, and I think that the audience gathered today is a testament to that necessary mix. These issues, as Pete mentioned, will be discussed today and tomorrow, and the output from this conference will help shape our research at RUSI over the next year in the fields of cyber and electromagnetics. We are setting up a cyber center actually at RUSI, so if anyone has any questions about that, please grab me afterwards. Some of you may also notice the change in the title of today's conference. This used to be called the Defense Information Superiority Conference. Not only is that hard to say, actually, it's a mouthful, but last year delegates agreed that gaining superiority in information warfare was not a level of dominance that was actually achievable, and especially with current spending plans. Understanding this, we worked hard to come up with a new title for the conference, and thanks in particular to Bill Robbins and Neil Couch, who I hope are here today, we came up with Information in Warfare. Now, of course, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Air Marshal Philip Osborne, a man I'm told needs no introduction, even with a group of 400 people. In fact, there are few people better placed in the British defense community to challenge some of the assumptions that we will be discussing today and tomorrow than the current Chief of Defense Intelligence, Air Marshal Philip Osborne. As most of you know, he joined the Royal Air Force over 30 years ago. You have his bio in front of you, so I won't repeat that, but he will talk about the approach we could take to exploit ISR opportunities and mitigate the threats, an issue he has focused on for many years, both as CDI and previously as Director of Capability at Joint Forces Command. So without further ado, welcome.
You're right, you look absolutely frightening. And there's a dreadful lot of you, but you all look obviously stunningly attractive, as always. Karen, thank you, and genuinely, it's a real pleasure to see so many of you here. I was originally invited to offer you a view from main building, but it was going to be odd to get you all over to MOD onto the 7th floor to look out over the Thames. And obviously, although I am a lodger in main building, I'm clearly in Joint Forces Command. So, Pete, that was a rubbish title, and therefore I ignored it. I'm also grateful to Pete for his grasp of conference fascism. And I'm sure we all feel appropriately put in our place. And if you could make sure your mobile phone is turned off, that would be a lovely thing. I feel like I'm in a cinema. Anyway, I'd like to add my thanks to our industrial sponsors. This conference is very important to the JFC. It's one of the main events where we get an opportunity to tell you what we think and to hear what you think. And therefore, your continued participation and increased participation is particularly welcome from our perspective. Clearly, we need help when we do that. So Airbus, HPE, and all the other sponsors, thank you very much indeed. I should also say thank you to Rusi for hosting us once again. I asked Pete if I could have the list of those who've helped organise this fantastic conference, and he said, please don't do that. Could you just tell the audience that Rusi really like people who sponsor their research? I don't know why he would have asked me to say that. And in advance, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you for your participation and your challenge, and for the next 50 minutes or so, your significant patience. And it is your participation that will turn this from something where we transmit at you actually to a conversation as well as a conference. So I would encourage your participation and challenge. I'm going to talk for a bit, probably about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to take Q&A. I will remind you, I am as deaf as a post, and although I do have 2 fully functioning hearing aids sat up there, I'm probably not going to be able to hear you. Karen will therefore translate for me, but she's got a very quiet voice, so I probably won't be able to hear her. So what might happen is I might walk towards you, and you'll think, why is he walking towards me? Because of the loudspeaker. But actually, I'm trying to read your lips. Unless, of course, you've asked me a really difficult question, and then you'll just see me walk out. We'll see how we get on. I must confess to being a little daunted to be asked to set the scene for such a wide-ranging and important conference, and I think it is important. Last year, I think we had a good discussion. I seem to recall I may have been accused at the end of last year of encouraging a bit more participation from an industrial perspective. I think that might be putting it mildly. But I'm pleased to say that this year, I think we've got a lot to celebrate. This is a crucial moment for UK defence and for the place of C4ISR and information. I think for the first time, we've got to put up or shut up. Why do I say that? Well, as we reflect on today's theme of the implications for the SDSR for us, it's important to remember how different this conference could have been. How different it would have been if many in this room, and I do mean everybody in this room, had not successfully built a C4ISR and information narrative over the last few years. How different would the conference have been if we'd not been able to collectively, successfully carry forward the warfare in the information age proposition into the SDSR? And how different would this conference have been without the SDSR and the government's ambition? And we should not forget the government's ambition and intent, which is enshrined in the SDSR and is now for us, actually, to deliver on. So, on balance, well done. I think you did a great job. I feel very senior officer. However, now the real work begins, which brings us to, from the conference perspective of information in warfare, I've been asked to offer a view on what the next 10 years might look like, and then touch on what this personal view might mean for our way of working. To do that, I'm going to look briefly at our frankly variable track record in predicting the future. Then, and perhaps counterintuitively, given what I've just said, I'm going to try to predict the future. It's good to see an old man learning lessons. Or at least draw out some themes and trends. Some will be familiar, some, however, may not. And then I'm going to close on some thoughts around how we might want to work in the future. But first, a couple of health warnings. And for those who've heard me speak before, you are very, very patient. For those who've heard me speak before, it's at this point that I would normally make a self-deprecating comment about being a tornado navigator, and hence not really worthy of your company. And you would smile knowingly, but slightly patronisingly about that comment. Different now, isn't it? Anyway, and much more importantly, my perspective is probably biased, as I've had some responsibilities over the last year for intelligence, C4ISR, counterintelligence, and cyber and the electromagnetic spectrum. And therefore you would expect me, I hope, to be an advocate. I mentioned way of working. Well, we've always struggled to properly describe our prospective way of working in a way that did not presuppose an equipment or a technology outcome. And this, at the same time, is both challenging and particularly important for our area of business. We instinctively know how we want to use a ship or a land formation or an aircraft. But explaining how we want to fight in and alongside the information domain, and hence across the electromagnetic spectrum, is far more difficult. Hence my attempt will probably be ham-fisted, but hopefully useful. What is much more important is that you take that work and really work on how is it we want to work, rather than what technology do we want to use. So, how good are we at accurately predicting the future? The challenge set any defence organisation is to do the best we can with what we have today, while configuring tomorrow's capability to the best it can be when tomorrow becomes today. Get this balance wrong within the constraints of resources, and we risk defeat today and decay and decreasing irrelevance in the future. Therefore, identifying what is happening today and what might happen tomorrow, and why, is critical. I'll come back to identifying what is happening today. For now, let's look at how good we've been at accurately predicting the future, noting perhaps our innate tendency towards linear thinking, one thing must follow another, and revisionist history. And I'm sure I am the only person in the audience who is guilty of revisionist history. So let's look back around 10 years and examine what we and the commentariat thought 2015 would look like. And as I said, I think it's fair to say that our performance was at best variable. Positively, looking at the musings of leading commercial organisations and think tanks, as well as Her Majesty's Government and Defence Intelligence, most of us were clear on the trajectory of China's economy, along with the BRICS and others. Most of us were clear on the growth of tension between China and Japan and the emergence of an increasingly authoritarian Russia, willing to use force to exert its will, and the subsequent pressure that could be applied and probably would be applied to democratic reforms within the states of the former Soviet Union. So far, so good. However, we all tended to underplay the scale and intensity of extremism, underplay the risk appetite of Russia, and overplay the economic challenges faced by China. While most of us got the pressures that contributed to the Arab Spring, we did not predict accurately either the scale or velocity of subsequent events, or the follow-on instability in Syria, for example. Al-Qaeda was singled out, but the rise and barbarism of Daesh was missed, as was the confluence of factors that have accelerated greatly a previously and long-held view about the challenges around migration. And the list goes on. Some events called well, others not called as well. So what can we learn? Well, one could ask why we should trust our ability to predict the future, having demonstrated that we are not able to do this consistently in the past. This approach would obviously prove a little terminal for the section in the conference that tries to predict the future. And in any case, all the lessons are not that bad. We've done some things well. But we can draw out some important points. For example, that we know that a lack of governance brings with it instability. What is not routinely acknowledged is that instability is only bad if the status quo was good, or at least acceptable. Allied to this, we know that shifts in any front line almost inevitably incur a rise in the transition of refugees. We can also see that mass political and social movements can be self-synchronizing and immensely influential, but they almost always generate unintended consequences. And just as clear is that dominant personalities and autocracies tend to go hand in hand, and those dominant personalities can be both extraordinarily constructive and wantonly destructive. And in this case, how often are clashes between states actually a conflict between egos and a sense of self projected onto a nation? In other words, the enduring mystery of personality-based grand strategic decision-making will almost certainly endure. Politics is personal. Looking more inwardly, we can learn that first, in our rules-based interconnected society, we will almost always act in alliance. But in acting within an alliance, sometimes with partners who are not as traditional as others, we will be rightly constrained by our own rules-based system. Our partners may be part of a different rules-based system. And also our inability to perfectly predict the future tells us that regardless of the efficacy of our foresight, we are more likely than not going to be surprised at some point. We will not be able to predict the future. And while our trend analysis tends to be okay, we've been guilty of blanding or watering down our analysis, and hence our identification of tipping points could probably be sharper. And while the nature of change, political, economic, and technological, can in some areas probably be discerned, it is the pace of that change that is more difficult to predict. Finally, it is one thing to predict accurately events or trends, but it is something entirely different to deliver predictions that are sufficiently hard-edged and compelling to drive timely decisions. And even that statement presupposes that decision makers are able to or want to act on that knowledge. It takes real bravery to do a thing, to avoid a thing happening. So what can we say about the future? And you'll have clocked that the title is slightly off, which proves that I can't even predict my PowerPoint slides will come up in the right order. However, what can we say about the future? Bearing in mind that we're not horologists, that we can never know what people actually think, and that projections become less reliable the further they forecast. I feel like a financial institution. The value of your investment can go down as well as up. What can we say about the future? Well, we might start with the usual predictions. As indicated in the National Security Strategy and the like, we can expect some years hence to be faced with many of the issues that are evident today. Terrorism and extremism will endure. There will be a continued resurgence of state-based threats, including from Russia, and the rules-based international order will come under even greater strain. Instability will continue to be centred on social inequality, demographic change and pressures, rapid and unplanned urbanisation, climate change and economic shocks. And will also likely be faced with an increased risk from pandemic and antimicrobiological resistant diseases. In capability terms, proliferation of higher-end capabilities will likely accelerate, especially in the arena of anti-access and area denial, our opponents and prospective opponents have learned. And that proliferation of anti-access area denial will continue to erode traditional Western advantage and manoeuvre space and challenge our ability to manage risk. As an example, from an airman's perspective, I am more used than not to flying in an environment where the air threat is relatively low. In the future, it is probably unusual to say that the air threat, potential, prospective, latent air threat, will be relatively low. And therefore, our operations depends on the risk appetite of the operational commander in how he chooses to deploy his forces. That is true of every single physical and virtual environment. So our ability to manage risk, our ability to know our own risk appetite, our ability to know our opponent's risk appetite, I would argue, becomes increasingly fundamental to the prosecution of warfare and as the military as a lever of national power. Moreover, the growth of increasingly sophisticated hybrid warfare will undoubtedly endure, not just in terms of the availability of tools that are openly there for opponents and allies to use, but also hybrid thinking. Most of us know that there are many nations that do hybrid thinking as well, if not better than we do. We also know there are many nations whose national decision-making structures actually suit hybrid thinking better than ours. Hybrid warfare is not best executed in a bureaucracy. The information age will continue to both mature and morph. The dominance and proliferation of information technologies and the explosion of cyber will accelerate. The demand for widely available crypto will increase, along with increased military and commercial pressure across the electromagnetic spectrum. Other actors will have access to these tools, long considered the preserve of high-end nations. Preeminent in this is probably routine access to space. I won't have told you anything there that you could not have worked out for yourself. Most of that was actually in the SDSR and the supporting documentation. What I suppose the important thing from my perspective is what I've described to you is linear. It's more of the same. And actually, the challenge for us is probably not just to recognize the inevitability of more of the same, but where things might be different. There are therefore less likely, more dangerous, but still wholly credible outcomes that we should also contemplate to test our thinking. And I would argue, as I look at what my predecessors and the like did, it is testing our assumptions that we could probably work harder at. And wouldn't it be good if we could test our assumptions as we make decisions? I'll come back to that. Now, as the Chief of Defence Intelligence, yes, it surprises me more than it surprises you, still. As the Chief of Defence Intelligence, you'd recognise it would be inappropriate for me to go into any detail about those less likely but prospectively more dangerous outcomes. But let me highlight just some generic examples to show you kind of what I'm thinking of. Those who do know me should also be impressed that this is an analytical technique, and you're hearing me talk about an analytical technique. Check me out. Example 1 could be described as one last throw of the dice. Perhaps a first world state whose economy is tanking and has to do something different, dramatically different, to make a difference. And that state, perhaps whose sense of self and history, or risk appetite, or system of governance, makes that gamble make more sense than perhaps it would do otherwise. Example 2 is a perfect storm. Autocratic governments with an unbalanced economic model, caught with a populace subdued by a controlling ideology and or money, and then an oil price stuck at $30 a barrel for 5 years or more, and terrorism driving the collapse of the tourism industry, leading to the constant collapse of governance and therefore adding to the pace and impact of migration, unintended consequences. Example 3 could be around non-discretionary intervention. We will, of course, always be in control of what we choose to do and the scale. Or are there occasions when we'll have no choice but to intervene in an open-ended way, perhaps in the face of irresistible provocation, like if extremists commit an extreme mass casualty attack, perhaps biological in nature? Now, of course, these wildcards are purely generic, and they might be very unlikely. But what that's trying to show you is it's very, very easy for the unlikely to become the likely. We should reflect back on politics is personal, and a lot of nations imprint personality onto the face of a nation. So what can we say about the future? Well, we could probably work on the following. The rub and friction between different rules-based systems will endure and escalate. Constant competition will increasingly dominate. And as a consequence, risk appetite, ours and our competitors, becomes very, very important. To manage risk, you have to understand your risk landscape. It is probable that the complexity of today in Syria and Iraq and in Libya, the shift in melange of state and non-state organizations, of tribes and gangs, of warlords and chieftains, this complexity will become more of the norm. And the impact on our resilience of alliances is that, as well as the obvious and essential need for interoperability, some of our allies have shifting to our eyes contradictory objectives. My enemy's enemy may be my friend today, but not tomorrow, which, as we have already seen, sets diplomacy a wicked challenge. And the need for coordinated use of all of the levers of national and organisational power in this constant competition will also increase. And the differences in rules-based systems in play will mean that the playing field can never be level. It may even be in a different park. Hybrid warfare within different rules-based systems is really difficult. All this introduces more variables, with more at stake, and hence the risks around miscalculation are likely to increase. And extreme extremism will continue to be perceived by some as far too successful to wither anytime soon. In some, we know that today is already dynamic and complex, with a mix of emerging truth and unhelpful, usually more powerful, perception. And the future is not linear, nor static, nor stable. It is interlinked and three-dimensional at its simplest, and it will always be subject to human choice, to shock, and to miscalculation. So bearing all this in mind, what conclusions might we draw about what capabilities we might need? What will we want? Well, our headmarks are probably simple. From strategic to tactical, from Prime Minister and CDS to soldier, sailor or airman, this more complex and interrelated operational context demands that firstly we have knowledge of what is happening in real time and insight into what others think is happening in real time. Secondly, we need foresight into the range of possibilities that might happen and how our actions and the actions of others might influence that future as it becomes the present. Thirdly, and interactively linked to our ability to know today and to look at tomorrow, should be an interactive decision-making process which lays out possible consequences and possible opportunities of our and others' decisions. And lastly, and this is where our conversations around capability normally start, We need the ability to influence and, where possible, dominate those potential outcomes within the full range of operating environments, from a military perspective: maritime, land, air, space, and electromagnetic, physical, virtual, and cognitive, both alone and with allies. From these headmarks, and again in the context of this conference, we will want to encourage decision makers who, at every level, think about how they want to make decisions, and who then proactively shape and welcome decision support, a fundamental human process that, while it can be far better supported by technology than it can be today, will remain a human activity. Decision makers should be human, supported by humans. We must be able to lay out those likely futures and the potential variations depending on our and others' actions. And in this, the boundary between intelligence, planning, and mission rehearsal will become increasingly and deliberately blurred. In all cases, we can see that our ability to gain insight to the future will be variable, and hence we will be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised that we will be surprised. I would therefore argue that mastering situational awareness and crisis response is non-discretionary if we are to avoid surprise becoming paralyzing shock. And then we need to deliver the fullest range possible of military effects, noting the ever-increasing dominance of information as part of a comprehensive full-spectrum approach, and how quickly constrained or contested operations across all of those operating environments have become the norm. Of note, our cyber and electromagnetic capability will be delivered as a partnership with the SIA, will be integrated across defence and offence, and will be both operationally pooled and opportunity-led. Importantly, full integration with other military effects will be second nature. We will also have to bear in mind that while cyber offence is potentially battle-winning, cyber resilience is non-discretionary. And in all of this, we'll need to be interoperable with enduring and more fleeting partners, ultra-persistent in intelligence and effect, capable of ubiquitous connectivity, and secure enough. Secure when I choose to be secure, not when the opposition choose to allow me. You'll have recognised that this outline user need is inevitably and unashamedly joint and C4ISR focused, and I've deliberately not talked about potential solutions, the opportunity of the commercial space, the need to embrace advances in automation and AI, and the need for different delivery strategies. If I did, it would be a very short conference. Those are for others to explore later today and tomorrow. However, to bring this vision to life, I offer a speculative, crude, future way of working as illustration. Let's take a snapshot of a future UK operation against a demonstrably hostile near-peer state, harbouring an aggressive extremist organisation. The deployed commander and his staff are developing the extant operational campaign plan. Their thinking is supported by the combination of an up-to-date interactive picture of the theatre with predictive, probabilistic predictions of blue, red, grey and white capabilities, and prospective courses of action, along with visualisation of the second and third order effects of those courses of action. This interactive planning process is informed and then adapted by real-time, real-world assessments of blue, red, grey and white effectiveness, updated through reach-forward assessments of tactical effectiveness and on-the-fly logistic updates. The desired course of action is then amended while in play. In effect, and in campaign planning terms, a continuous and applicable question 4. Advised by his assigned integrated MOD SIA team, the deployed commander has combined the full range of cyber and electromagnetic effects with Jeff maritime, land, air and space capabilities, thereby allowing him to deceive and overwhelm his opponent, preemptively negate an imminent cyber attack on his deployed network, and unlock key parts of the highly contested battle space. Across that battle space, force elements from all 5 environments are simultaneously using and updated the shared real-time physical and virtual picture of the opposition's capability, actions, and likely intent. Responding to the continually updated ATO, an F-35 has left the tanker and run a final endgame mission rehearsal utilising that same real-time picture of the opposition before threat avoiding and then precisely striking a mobile high-value target, aided by in-cockpit queuing from a land formation, instantaneous collateral damage analysis, and then post-strike battle damage assessment. A few minutes later, back in London and coordinated with other coalition members and as rehearsed in their previously war-gamed run-through, senior decision-makers have authorised disclosure to key nations and international organisations of the evidence of opposition support to extremists, and the aim, legal validity and all-source pre- and post-strike assessment of the recent operational strike. Simultaneously, the existing multi-platform communications campaign steps up a gear, explaining the UK's actions and emphasising legality, proportionality, and the parallel diplomatic and economic activities. A crude way of working, I know, and yes, a higher-end example, but many of those ideas, if appropriate, would be equally applicable to the full range of potential conflicts and competitions. And we can perhaps see that, to paraphrase badly Clausewitz, whilst the character of conflict may change, the essential nature of war, as both a dynamically violent human struggle and a quintessentially political act, remains constant. War may be substituted by competition, and violence is not predetermined, but the principles remain the same. Indeed, it is our sense that this linkage is reinforced inextricably within the information age. In conclusion, I hope my perspective on the future context, subsequent user demands, and very clumsy attempt to outline a representative way of working have gone some way to setting the scene for this important conference. Next up, and it's at this point I now feel like some form of tour guide. Next up, we'll review the implications of the SDSR outcome in a little more detail, explore the key elements of a full-spectrum approach and enabling integrated operations, before asking Commander JFC to outline his leading and unique perspective on what we are seeking to deliver. Tomorrow, we're lucky enough to have the Minister for Defence Procurement challenge our thinking before getting into thought-provoking sessions on the EME and future internet, disruption and organisational implications, and sovereignty and the military-industrial relationship. Some random old bloke will then return to close with some concluding and probably self-evident thoughts. With that, I have one last request. I ask that you engage fully with the conference and ensure that our discussions are both rich and, where necessary, challenging. I really am very grateful for your time and attention, and I look forward, with a little trepidation, to answering your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. You've been very patient.